But I'm an anomaly in the midst because I'm the only preacher they know. And so every year we end up having a meal together. And we're sitting down and having this meal. And of course you start shooting the breeze. And these guys, because they don't have any real spiritual framework of church, they always start to ask me these really kind of bizarre questions, but they want to know, what is it I do? And so this summer, true story, so one of them says to me, so are you like one of those televangelists that you own a jet? And I said, oh, don't be ridiculous. I don't own a jet. The church owns the jet.
Welcome to Church of the Rock from Winnipeg. Stay tuned to this week's thought-provoking message from Pastor Mark Hughes.
So today I'm carrying on the series that I began a few weeks ago called The Blessed Lifestyle. And we've been going through this acrostic, B-L-E-S-S, and what it is about is the most accessible, natural, easy way for anybody, introvert or extrovert, to share their faith, and above all, it's actually biblical. So here's how it works. The B stands for begin with prayer. The L is listen with care. The E is eat together. The S stands for share in love, and the last S is, or serve in love rather, and the last S is share your story. So week one we started with beginning with prayer and how the scripture tells us, first of all, to pray for all men, those in authority, that they may come to God and to the knowledge of the truth. So that's the first one. Last week we talked about listening, and that we need to listen before we speak. And of course this listening one isn't necessarily step two. It's something you do all the way along the way. And so today we're going to talk about eating together. And you know, I'll tell you, I'll be honest with you, this week when I started thinking about this, I thought, how am I going to do a whole series or a whole message on eat together? I mean, that's not a whole message. I thought everybody, we don't talk about eat together, we just do it, right? I mean, you live together, what do? You eat together. It's sort of that simple. But then the more I thought about it, the more significant I thought it was, and I realized, you know, what we do in our families, we live together, so we eat together, and what happens when the family begins to break down? What's the first thing to go? The first thing to go is you stop eating together. You know, it was Rodney Dangerfield that had this line. He had said this. He said, hey, we have separate bedrooms. We eat our meals apart. We take separate vacations. We're doing everything we can to keep our marriage together. So what we find when we look into Scripture is that we found that one of Jesus' strategies, in fact, one of his great strategies, was eating together with people. So we all know that he had 12 disciples, and he gathered these 12 men, and they traveled together, they ministered together, they lived together, and guess what? They ate together. And about halfway through his ministry, one day he announces to them, I no longer call you servants, I now call you friends. He calls them friends. You spend time with people, you spend time eating together, guess what? Servants become friends. And then at the end of his ministry, you all remember they had the Passover meal. We know it as the Last Supper. And he got these men together the last time, just he and the 12, and they got together and they had this meal together, which is absolutely famous, and everybody understands the Last Supper. Here's what is interesting. The Passover meal was the most important meal in Jewish culture and is even to this day. And it was a meal that you would share with your family. Now, their families were all back still in Galilee, all of them, and so he shared this meal with these men because these men were no longer servants, they were no longer friends, they were now family. They were now his brothers. And so that's the basis in which we're going to talk today about how when we eat together, things change. So we're going to look at Jesus' methodology when it came to eating together. We are in Luke chapter 5, fascinating story that you all know, but I'm going to look at it, I think, in a very different light than you've thought about before. So Luke chapter 5, verse 27 says this. After these things, he went out and saw a tax collector named Levi sitting in the tax office. And he said to him, follow me. So he left all, rose up, and followed him. Then Levi gave him a great feast in his own house. And there were a great number of tax collectors and others who sat down with them, and their scribes and their Pharisees complained against his disciples, saying, why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners? And Jesus answered and said to them, Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. So we've all read that story about this tax collector named Levi. And let me sort of inform you of something that you may or may not know, is that Levi and Matthew, the apostle, are the same person. And that disciple that wrote the Gospel of Matthew, same person as Levi. You say, well, why is he called something else? Well, you will discover that many of these people both had Greek and Hebrew names. And so Levi was his Hebrew name. Matthew was his Greek name. We have Simon and Peter, same person. Thomas and Didymus, same person. Jesus and Yeshua, or Joshua, same person. Jesus was his Greek name. Yeshua was his Hebrew name. So that's just to clarify who this Levi was. And so what happens is we have Matthew, he comes to Christ, and he becomes a follower. He becomes this dedicated disciple of Jesus and spent 3.5 years with him. And then it says, then he held a feast for him at his own house. Now, don't think for a minute that it was the same day. The way it's written, because it just follows right in the last sentence, it seems like it was that day he held a feast. It probably wasn't that day. It could have been days, it could have been weeks later. And here's what I think happened. I'm just speculating. But I think what Jesus did and said, okay, Matthew, I think we have a great opportunity here. I mean, you know all these tax collectors. You hang out with these guys. What do you say we do an outreach event, and you invite all these scoundrel friends of yours, and I'll show up because I would love to meet these guys. And so that's what he did. And he has this feast, and there's this great number of tax collectors and others there, because Matthew would have known all these people. And so they all gathered, and there's Jesus right smack in the middle of them. So then the Pharisees and the scribes, they lose their minds over this. And they said, what are you doing? What's your master doing hanging out with tax collectors and hanging out with sinners? And they're just like incensed. And of course, don't miss the fact that Jesus points out and says, he gives them this little explanation. He says, people who are well don't need a doctor, right? It's people who are sick that need a doctor. And people who are righteous don't need to repent, but those who are sinners need to. And so there's a bit of irony in there because, the scribes and Sadducees and Pharisees were not near as righteous as they thought they were. So there's a little bit of irony there. But here's what you need to understand about tax collectors. Tax collectors were the absolute worst. I mean, tax collectors were absolutely considered the lowest of the low. And today it'd be compared to like the used car salesman, right? Or I could include lawyers or politicians if you want, but I'm trying to give them a break today. These tax collectors were considered the quintessential sinner. And I'll tell you why. They were actually Jewish men that worked for the Roman government to extract taxes from the Jewish people to give to the Romans so that they could continue to hold these people in occupation. So you can imagine why, when it came to thinking of what a sinner was, the sinner in their minds, the worst of the worst, was the tax collector. And Jesus is hanging out with the sinners. And so the tax collectors, he's hanging out with them, he's eating with them. And just so you know, this isn't the only time this happened. There's another story where Jesus broke bread with another tax collector. And I just want to add this one to the mix. And you all remember the story. It's probably a couple of years later. And Jesus, by this time, his fame has gone out. People know who he is, and big crowds are gathering around. And there's a tax collector by the name of Zacchaeus. And what was unique about Zacchaeus? He was short. And so maybe you can't stop this guy from collecting your taxes. But you know what we can do? We can stop him from seeing Jesus. And all he wanted to do was catch a glimpse, and he kept on kind of poking through the crowd. And these guys were all blocking him out. They wouldn't let him. I mean, maybe they couldn't stop this guy, but they could stop him from seeing Jesus, which I think is sort of funny. And so then Zacchaeus realizes he's not going to win this battle. He's too small. He's not going to get through these big, burly Hebrew men. So he goes and climbs up the sycamore tree. So he's hanging in the sycamore tree, waiting for Jesus to come by. And Jesus comes by and walks by and sees him up in the tree. You all remember this. He looked up and said, Zacchaeus, come down at once, for today I must go to your house. And he went to Zacchaeus' house, and he broke bread with Zacchaeus. He had a meal with him and all of his tax collector buddies and whoever else he knew. And so we don't actually know what Jesus said during that time. We just know they ate together, and they were obviously conversing. And all of a sudden, Zacchaeus does something really strange, and he stands up and he says, I've made this decision that I'm going to give half my goods to the poor, and if I've wronged any man, I'm going to repay him fourfold. Now, I have a question for you. Did Jesus tell him to do that? There's no record that Jesus told him to do that. I think if he had told him, it would have said he told him. Not only that, there's no command. You don't have to do that. This was something Zacchaeus came up on his own. You say, why did he come up with that? I'll tell you why. Because when you encounter Jesus, Jesus has the power to change you. And this is what happens. And this is why people need to encounter Jesus. This is why they need to meet Jesus. Because even without hearing a word, if they will meet Jesus, if they will encounter Jesus, things happen. And so all Jesus did, his simple strategy, was to go eat with sinners. Not only tax collectors, but prostitutes and all kinds of other people. And he ate with these people. And so then what happened, he's got a bit of a reputation. Remember this? And what did they accuse Jesus of being? A friend of? A friend of sinners. Do you know why they called him that? Do you know why they accused him of being a friend of sinners? Anybody know? Because he was a friend of sinners. Aren't you glad to come to church and you learn this stuff? Well, I figured this stuff up. I spend hours figuring this stuff out, and I share it with you. So they call him a friend of sinners because he was a friend of sinners. I don't want you to miss this. Jesus never treated anyone like a spiritual project. No one was ever an evangelistic project. Do you know that nobody wants to be a project? Nobody wants to be your project. And that's why I always tell people, I warn them, I say, you know what you should do? You should not evangelize your friends. You should enjoy your friends. I mean, there's something powerful about this. If we begin to enjoy our friends, then, you know, the evangelism thing is secondary to that. And that's where you start. So I got to tell you something interesting. So some of you know that I play tennis in the summer. I'm with this men's group, a very diverse group of men that I play tennis with. I'm going to tell you this part right up at the front. A bunch of them came to church this morning and sat in the front row at the first service. And I thought, as soon as I saw them there, I'm going to tell them this story. And so anyway, these guys, I play with them, and what happens is we're from different backgrounds, and I'll tell you, they have no framework of church. This is not something most of them really do. They're not in church on Sunday morning. They're on the tennis court on Sunday morning. And so, you know, they're doctors, and they're dentists, and they're lawyers, and they're different people of different professions, and a unique and diverse group of people. Everybody's different, and they're different. But I'm an anomaly in the midst because I'm the only preacher they know. And so every year we end up having a meal together. And we're sitting down and having this meal. And of course you start shooting the breeze. And these guys, because they don't have any real spiritual framework of church, they always start to ask me these really kind of bizarre questions. But they want to know, what is it I do? And so this summer, true story, so one of them says to me, so are you like one of those televangelists that you own a jet? And I said, oh, don't be ridiculous. I don't own a jet. The church owns the jet. And then another one says, I bet you stand up there and you ask people to give you all their money. I said, no, that would be greedy to ask them for all their money. I just ask for 10%. I let them keep the rest of it. And then another one said, I bet you tell stories about us. I bet you come here and then you go back on Sunday morning, you tell stories about us. I said, absolutely. I'm just doing research here on the reprobate lifestyles of you degenerate heathens. And I said, if you play your cards right, you'll be in Sunday's sermon. So they show up this morning and they're in Sunday's sermon. How good is that? And by the way, they loved it that I was talking about them. But see, here's what I don't want you to miss about this story. I'm actually not trying to evangelize them. I'm trying to enjoy them. I've actually become friends with these men. And when you become friends with people, things change. And that is the secret. That's why the E stands for eat together. And let me tell you what the researchers showed us on this, because it's quite fascinating. We never think about that there is even research on this, but there is. And when you break bread with someone, when you eat together, they've discovered that what it does is it actually changes the perceptions people have of inequalities. Particularly what it does is it radically changes people's perspectives on race, on culture, on religion, and socioeconomic background. And what it becomes, eating together, this is true, and you probably know this, is what it does is it becomes the great equalizer. All of a sudden, people become equal when you eat together. And probably everybody in this room will remember the most famous speech of Martin Luther King Jr. It was the I Have a Dream speech. probably one of the most famous speeches, not only in U.S. history, but in world history. And I'm not going to obviously quote the whole thing, but there's an excerpt I want to share with you that probably most of you remember, and I think it makes my point. So he says this in his speech. He said, "I have a dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and it will live out the true meaning of its creed, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream today." And what he was talking about, if you caught those two stanzas, the first one was, I have a dream that all men would be treated equal. And I have a dream that they will sit down together at the table of brotherhood. And you see, what happens is when you have equality, you eat together. And when you eat together, you develop equality. And let me tell you a personal story about this that I think will illustrate it perfectly. So Kathy and I have this friend, and there's no other way to describe him, that he's an eccentric, and he has the most diverse and eclectic group of friends you could ever imagine, people from every strata and every socioeconomic background, you name it. And he invited us to this dinner party, and I looked around, and there were all these unusual, disparate people. I thought, these people shouldn't be together in the same room. These people are all from different worlds and different backgrounds, different religions, you name it. And he had gathered them all together for this very unique dinner. And so then he did something even more eccentric. He didn't let us sit with our spouse. He broke us all up and he assigned seating. He has this great big, huge round table in his dining room. And he put us all at different seats with different people that maybe we knew or didn't know, but certainly not with our spouses. And so I ended up at this table between these two men, and one I'll call Larry, and the other one I'll call Lawrence. And so Larry was on my left hand, Lawrence was on my right hand, and Larry is a house painter. Larry actually only works enough to buy gas for his boat and bait for his fishing line, and that's what he loves to do, fish. Actually, he likes to do three things. He likes to paint, fish, and drink, not necessarily in that order. And anyway, so that's Larry. And on the other side of me is Lawrence, and Lawrence is the CEO and president of one of the biggest companies and most profitable companies in all of Winnipeg. And so I'm looking at these two men, and I think, I can't believe how diverse these two guys are. And of course, I'm probably closer to Larry than I am to Lawrence, and you kind of know that. But nevertheless, there I was in the midst, and the whole table was like that. And you know what got me was this, is that this moment of sitting together was a great equalizer, because we all ate the same food, we all listened to the same stories, and we all laughed at the same jokes. We were all brought together at the same level and on the same plane. Why? For the simple reason that we had eaten together. When we look at this thing called breaking bread, here's my point. Breaking bread breaks down barriers. And I want to tell you a sort of fascinating story that happened to me a few years ago. I was invited to speak at a conference, and they wanted to talk about evangelism. And for whatever reason, they decided to hold it at the Salvation Army Lighthouse Mission. And those of you that know our downtown know where that is. It's right in the corner of Main and Higgins, right smack in the middle of Skid Row. And it's right there, this mission. Some of you have maybe been there or volunteered there or whatever. And I'd actually never been there before. And they had a 4-day conference. They asked me to come once a day. I wasn't actually part of the conference. I was a guest speaker. They asked me to come and speak it on evangelism. And they said, we want you to come and we want you to speak for an hour every day at 11 o'clock till 12 o'clock. And we're wondering if you can come and do that. So I did that. And so I thought, well, this would be interesting. So I went down there and I was in the Salvation Army mission every day from 11 to 12. And one of the unusual things, because they held it in the chapel. And so it was all these pastors, and they're all dressed in suits and different things. And one of the things they did, for whatever reason, I don't know, but they invited the homeless people to come to the conference if they wanted. And so at any given session, there'd be 30 or 40 pastors in the room and 4 or 5 homeless people sitting in the back listening in, which was kind of cool. I thought that was neat to be inclusive like that. So anyway, I was there day after day. And I was going up and doing my 1 hour and talking about evangelism. Then on the last day, on the Friday, I finished my session, and there had been a homeless woman, who had been there at every one of these sessions. And she came up to me after the session, and she said, can I talk to you a moment? And I said, sure. She says, I need to say something to you. You have no idea what you're talking about. I say, funnily enough, I hear that all the time. But she says, you have no idea what you're talking about. You don't know anything about us. You don't know anything about this community. You don't know anything about this world that we live in. And she says, I have some advice for you. I have an offer to make you. Why don't you come and live down here for a weekend with us? Why don't you this weekend spend the weekend here with us and find out who we really are and what really makes us tick? And so I said, I would do that, but I don't think my wife will let me. That's the first excuse. And I said, and I have little kids at home, and I got to take them to soccer, and I have a car. It's parked on the street at a meter. I can't stay here all weekend. I was making one excuse after another. And I realized what a wimp I'd been at being a total wuss about this, and it was a legitimate offer. Come and see what we're all about. So then I said, I'll tell you what. Why don't I go have lunch with you? Where are you having lunch? She said, I'm going to the dining room here. And I said, would it be okay if I joined you at least for lunch? Because it was noon. And she said, yeah, that would be a good idea. Come do that. So I went and sat at this table with this group of homeless people. And I had nothing to offer. And instead, I just said, why don't you tell me your stories? And these homeless people began to tell me their stories about how they had ended up on the street and the kind of life they had brought up. And I'm telling you, every single one of these stories was heart-wrenchingly painful. And I didn't say a word to them because, you know what? I had nothing to say. But I just listened to them, and I thought, I can sit here and eat with these people, and by doing so, we all start to get at a new level, and everything changes. Because when you break bread together, you break down barriers. Now, I want to kick this up one more notch, because we know this, that the Great Commandment, both Old Testament and New Testament, it's the same. And the Great Commandment is this: to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, and all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Both Old Testament and New Testament, you know that. But in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus kicked it up to another level. And you all know this because you've read my book, A Greater Perspective, right? And so Jesus said, you've heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, you must love your enemy. He said, I must love your enemy. And Jesus is the only one of any world religion ever that has declared and told his followers that their responsibility was actually to love their neighbor, not to tolerate love their enemy rather, not to tolerate them, but to actually love them, not to just forgive them, but to love them. I mean, that is a very, very, very high bar. And so here's an interesting story for you. After the Civil War was a terrible time because you had a nation fighting each other. You had, brothers and people right across the lane or right across the river fighting each other in this battle, and this battle raged on. And Abraham Lincoln was the president at the time. Finally, the war ended, and he was trying to make some peace of this, and he did something very unusual as a Christian man. What he was doing was he was pardoning the enemy. And he was pardoning these people, pardoning these generals, and pardoning these Confederates. And he had an advisor come to him and said, Mr. Lincoln, what are you doing? Do you not wish to destroy your enemy? To which he said, isn't that what I do when I make them my friend? You see, that's a very powerful thing. And not only, how do you make your enemy your friend? And I'll tell you how you do it. You have to sit down at the table of brotherhood. You have to sit down and have a meal together. 30 years ago, the year's 1993, and I tried my hand at politics, and some of you may or may not know that. How many of you knew that I ran in the 1993 federal election? How many of you knew that? So just a minority of people here, but I did. I ran. But anyway, I tried my best, and I gave it a go. And so we were spending all this time with each other, and I discovered something about politics. See, I've been in ministry for quite a few years, and ministry is not always easy. It's not always an easy run. People criticize you, they judge you, they call you names. I mean, it's a tough place, you're dealing with human beings and people's emotions get riled up. And then I go into politics and I realize it's actually worse. And it's far more toxic and far more acrimonious in the political arena than it is in the ministry. And I thought, these people don't even know me. They don't even know me. And they're criticizing and insulting me and calling my names. At least in the church, I'm criticized by people I love. Right? I'm not sure that's somehow better. So anyway, long story short, so I run this election. I finished a close second, by the way. It was a great campaign, and I was pretty happy about that. But I'm telling you, it did leave a sort of a bitter taste in my mouth. The whole experience, like I said, it was very adversarial. It was very acrimonious. And I realized after the election that I had resentment in my heart, and particularly towards the winner. And the person who won the election was a man by the name of Reg Alcock. And Reg, here's a picture of him. He actually became a very important figure in the cabinet. He was the minister responsible for the Treasury Board. And he was this imposing figure. He was about 6.5 feet tall. At one point, he was 400 pounds, and I'm not just making that number up. He had this booming voice. And of course, he went on to a very kind of illustrious political career. And I thought to myself, I think I have resentment towards this man in my heart for what had happened during the campaign. And I thought, you know what? That's not my style. That's not how I roll. Because you know what I do? I forgive everybody. I forgive everybody all the time. We didn't really know each other because we had only debated each other. And I saw him in the debate setting, but I never saw him on any other level. We would say hi at the beginning or the end of the debate, but we really didn't interact on a personal level. So I only knew him as far as him being an adversary. So I phoned him up and I said, I'd really like to have lunch with you. Would you let me buy you lunch? So he agreed, and the two of us went to a restaurant, and we sat down, and we joked a little bit about the election and some of the things that had happened, and I congratulated him on his win and different things. And then I spent some time to actually get to know him. And then as we talked, here's what happened, because we're breaking bread together. And as we talked, I started to realize that I actually liked this guy on a personal level, that I could actually be his friend. Because breaking bread breaks down barriers. And you know what? I've discovered something, that the reason people don't like each other is because they don't actually know each other. And you know what ended up happening? I ended up becoming friends with him. These two adversaries, these two political adversaries, actually on a personal level, ended up as friends. A couple of years later, we had bought our first building. It was at 2211 Pembina Highway. Today it's a Shoppers Drug Mart on the corner of Markham and Pembina Highway. But we owned that building. It was our church. It was our first building we owned. We were having the grand opening, and I thought to myself, who should I invite to be our special guest at our grand opening? And I thought, I know. I'll invite our Member of Parliament, my friend, Reg Alcock. So I invited him, not just to come, I invited him to come and speak. And he got up on the stage at our grand opening, and he said all kinds of lovely things about me. Told me how much he respected me, and he told me, just a bunch of really nice things, and congratulated us on this building, and said some nice things. And then he went and sat down in that building approximately right there. So he went and sat down, and then I stood up there, and I preached my guts out. And I wasn't preaching directly at him, but I told the story of Daniel in Babylon. Daniel in the world of politics and dealing with that and always standing firm and being true to himself and true to what he believed and how he survived Babylon by being true to himself. And I really preached it. I threw it down that day. And so then, I'll never forget this. So then Reg gets up to his feet. I just finished preaching. I just walked down the stairs. Reg gets out of his seat and he strides over those giant hands of his and he shook my hand vigorously and he said, "Mark, that was a hell of a good speech." To which I said, "Well, thanks, Reg. That's not the way I would have put it, but thank you for enjoying that." And we ended up, these two political adversaries, as I said, became friends because what? We ate together and broke bread together. And then what happened was a few years later, 2008, he had a heart attack in the Winnipeg airport and fell to the ground and passed away. And I remember how heartbroken I was, and I remember thinking I had lost a friend that day. And you see, here's the secret to this. We live in this world of broken people that are not so much different than us. They're really no different than us. And they need Jesus as much as the next guy. And Mother Teresa once said this, the problem with the world is we draw the circle of the family too small. Well, at the very least, we draw the circle of our friends too small. And what would happen if we began to reach out to the world, begin to love people, and simply sat down together at the table of brotherhood? Because breaking bread breaks down barriers.
If you'd like a booklet to help you understand more about God's gift of forgiveness and reconciliation through Jesus Christ, please contact us, and we'd be happy to send you a free copy of the Book of Hope. visit our website at www.churchoftherock.ca. Thank you for watching, and God bless you.